Well, hi, I'm Julie Shapiro with Keystone Policy Center, and I'm excited to be moderating this panel on control and access in CRISPR and intellectual property in agriculture. We're going to have a great conversation from a variety of perspectives and vantage points on what's at stake, what matters, where the uncertainties or controversies might lie, and also, to the extent we can, what are some of the interesting paths forward. So before we dive into some of the questions for this panel, I want to ask panelists just to introduce yourselves, say who you are, who you're with, and maybe what kind of perspective you're bringing to this discussion. Start with you, Matt.
All right. Well, my name is Matt Miller. I work for Corteva Agri-Sciences, where I lead our open innovation, technology acquisition, and licensing groups. And for me, CRISPR has been a part of our company's life now for a few years. And it's also core to what I'm doing, first in terms of getting access to the technology, and also in providing access to others to use the technology.
Great, thanks. Carmen?
My name is Carmen Bain, and I'm a professor of sociology at Iowa State University. And I'm part of a research team that's looking at some of the emergent public concerns related to gene-edited crops and foods, and thinking about how we might build public trust in gene-edited foods, and how we might think about how we can govern them in order to address some of those concerns and public trust issues.
Hi, my name is Greg Graff. I'm a professor of agricultural and resource economics at Colorado State University. My research has long looked at the role of the intellectual property system in incentivizing innovation in our agricultural system, both from the perspective of public sector or university inventors, as well as industry, and the role of technology transfer in the economic relationship between those two.
Hi, my name is Fanli Chow, and I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Where I sit is as a kind of cross-mission area coordinator of agricultural biotech policy. And in that space, we have several interests from a USDA perspective. We want to use this technology by our scientists or our agricultural research service. By scientists we do fund a lot of extramural research to bring products to market. We're also very interested from an export perspective. So as our farmers are growing products developed through new technologies like CRISPR, how do we ensure that we have a fair shake on the foreign marketplace and ensure that there is a smooth regulatory processes and also a smooth market access potential for our products. And thirdly, we also have a regulatory arm where we regulate certain products of agricultural biotechnology. So we're thinking about how our current processes apply to products of CRISPR and other new technologies, and how is that fit for purpose.
Great, thanks. To start us off, I just want to do a little bit of kind of foundational table setting to make sure folks understand why intellectual property matters in CRISPR and agriculture. You know, why are we even having this conversation? So I want to start with you, Greg, just kind of set the stage for us. What do you think folks need to know or understand in a general sense around CRISPR and agriculture and intellectual property? And in particular, why does it matter? What are the stakes around getting it right?
Sure. So CRISPR clearly is a transformational invention, a breakthrough in the life sciences, and it's having very broad impacts in medicine, in industry, in agriculture. Within the agricultural space, we've long been concerned about the monopolization of some of the core tools, or even of seed systems or other inputs to the agricultural process. So as soon as CRISPR came onto the scene and there were questions and contests over the intellectual property to the core tools, it immediately sent up flags for people working in the agricultural sciences as to how and whether they would be able to use this technique in the laboratory. So I'd say there are maybe two general broad problem areas here. And the first one is the access question, and by virtue of that, the incentive to use the tool in a research program or in a corporate innovation setting. But that's kind of narrow. That's focused within industry, or as well, maybe the land-grant universities, other research universities and institutes around the world. But more broadly then, there's also the public perception looking at that system and how it is operating and how those tools are being controlled and whether they're more monopolized or more democratized, to use the terminology that has been emerging in this conversation about this question. And the public's perception of these techniques and tools, the public's trust of these techniques and tools, and the degree to which many of the smaller players in the system are going to be willing to pick them up and move forward with them are informed by this perception of its accessibility.
Great, thanks. And we're going to talk in this panel a bit about perceptions, public trust, Carmen, as you described, how it interacts with regulation, how it interacts with the market process. Sticking just for a moment further with these questions of just foundational concepts, what do folks really need to understand about intellectual property in CRISPR? And maybe what are some common misconceptions that folks have heard that maybe we need to clarify? Any things that folks out there would need or want to know in order to have this larger debate about the role of IP in these conversations?
Yeah, so perhaps I can take it. I mean, the role of IP is, of course, important in all scientific disciplines, and also particularly in those disciplines where IP serves to bring products to market. In the case of CRISPR, that is a vast question, right? Because we're talking particularly about plant agriculture here, but the applications of CRISPR are in animal agriculture as well, and they are, of course, in human health. All technologies that are being used to develop products, particularly in the case where the development of the product involves a large sum of money, right? When you need to develop a new drug, or if you need to develop a new trait in a crop, and you're going to invest multi-million dollars to get there, companies tend to rely on the intellectual property to give them sort of a certain runway, if you want, to develop the technology. So from that perspective, IP is very important.
So just in my travels around the world, talking about regulatory processes for CRISPR-derived product, a lot of people ask me about IP, and I don't know anything about IP. And I think one of the misconceptions globally is that for research and discovery, that there's constraints to use this tool. So I think that's something that really needs to be clarified and perhaps better publicizing a more global perspective is, as a researcher doing basic research and discovery, what is your access, right? So that is, I think that's an important question, or uncertainty or misconception around the globe, really.
Yeah.
Can someone elaborate on that briefly, just what that distinction is?
Maybe I could lay it out this way. I'm going to draw a little diagram in the air. You've got a foundation of science on which so much of the work is going on in the agricultural science. And within that sphere, which Fanli is referring to right now, access is virtually free and open. There is an organization called AdGene that is making the biological materials available, the scientific tools available to any laboratory that is willing to essentially pay the processing and shipping fees and to sign a material transfer agreement, assuring that they are going to use it for research purposes only. That means you're going to stay in this band. But you then move up to another tier when you begin to commercialize. But in the commercial space, I want to take that and chop it into three. There are three fundamentally different kinds of intellectual property working in agriculture. There's intellectual property around germplasm, around the whole plant, the seed. And many of these kinds of intellectual property are not even denominated by patents within our intellectual property system. They're protected by plant variety protections or plant breeders' rights, where they're simply protected behind the biological mechanism of hybridization and the fact that you cannot, it's kind of a biological copy protection. Next to that, we then have traits, genes, or suites of genes that work together, and there'll be protections over those genetic traits. And then finally, the third category would be intellectual property protections over tools or methods, how you get the traits into the germplasm, and all the various processes around bringing that to market then.
And since we're talking about CRISPR in particular, we're kind of talking about that latter category of the tool itself.
Thank you, yes. CRISPR is in the tools category.
And so does any one person or entity own CRISPR? And is ownership even the right term? I think a lot of folks talk about ownership and control kind of interchangeably, but can we help clarify those dynamics?
The dynamics of the patent landscape have been considerable, and it's been widely publicized that there's been an interference between University of California and the Broad Institute and affiliated institutions. That has been playing out in the US in one way and in Europe another way. But in fact, there are an entire suite, dozens, hundreds of other patents over either alternate versions of the CRISPR-Cas editing system, CRISPR/something else editing systems, or there are various components that can be opted in or out of that system. So it's a very complex, very dynamic, and very evolving landscape.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, what I perhaps add, for us, and Greg made a fantastic description of the landscape. What I'd say from a corporate perspective, what's most important for us is what we call freedom to operate, is to have the necessary rights to be able to use the technology, the tool in this case, to develop our products. So from there, then there is a nuance. Do you just want freedom to operate, or do you want some element of control? And that is sort of eventually something that, if you are able to negotiate proper access, you have a decision to make. Which way do you want to go? Can you negotiate, and can you get the freedom to operate and some control? Do you want only freedom to operate? I mean, that's sort of what we have to decide if we have the chance to decide that.
Great, thanks. So a little more complex than just saying somebody owns CRISPR. A lot of dimensions to that we could dig into further, but I want to pivot just a little bit to move beyond, what are we talking about with intellectual property and maybe what are the things we need to make sure folks understand, to what are the controversies, what are the disputes, what are the unknowns? And I think this these questions can apply to those who are really focused on understanding intellectual property and studying that, but also to those who are focused on understanding the broader landscape around the perceptions and intersections of intellectual property with other domains in society at large. So let's start with the controversies. And I'm actually going to go to you, Carmen, just to ask you to speak a bit about your research and what you're learning about the primary things that drive people's perceptions about CRISPR, agriculture, and intellectual property.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're here today because of the enormous societal debates we've had around GMOs. And so we're having conferences like this largely because many stakeholders are trying to avoid precisely that, many of those enormous disruptive debates. And I think that's really progressive, that we are trying to reflect on some of the controversies, some of the ways that we handled the GMO debate, and think about how can we do this differently. And I think that's really important. And so I think Greg made some really important points that one of the really fundamental concerns that people had around GMOs was the tight control that a tiny handful of companies had over that GMO technology and then the traits that were developed out of it. And so some of the concern is that, that we will see greater access to CRISPR in order to be able to develop traits that people would view as more beneficial to a wider array of people. So I think the question of access is really critical, that people are anxious to ensure that technologies are not just controlled by a tiny handful of people, that they are used in a way that will attempt to deliver as many beneficial traits as possible to a wide array of people. But I think on the flip side, and this is interesting too, because we've come out of the GMO debate, and so the focus there was on this tight control, I think the flip side is that in terms of access poses another set of potential controversies and concerns that people have, because then you have a broader array of actors and then people are concerned to what standards are they abiding by, or what rules and oversight are they compelled to follow. So I think just because we have greater access doesn't mean that the controversies are going to go away. They might shift. And so always being alert to them and thinking about how to engage with them.
Thanks, Carmen. Fanley, in your role looking at trade and regulation, what are the key concerns and controversies that relate back to this discussion on control and access?
So I think just reflecting on what Carmen has said about perception of control, and this is from a regulatory perspective, we would like to think as we develop regulations, it's a very kind of technology neutral and company neutral approach, right? Our protection goals are human safety, animal safety, environmental safety. Doesn't matter who's bringing that product to market. But I think the development of the regulation has this overlay of what's the policy landscape, what is a regulatory policy? And that is much more nuanced and is influenced by this perception of control. I think especially I think if you're looking at the GMO debate, it's like US and some countries that produce GM products were kind of out the gate making regulations. So for a lot of the other countries that are developing regulations after products have to come to market, they are looking at who has control. And perhaps that's influencing their regulatory policy, right? So they're thinking about relative regulatory policy with a view on who is bringing things to market. And that level of the hurdle they create then is very much, I think, by that perception, right? So then how the regulation you promulgate from that policy, how they impact the smaller folks, right, is not, you don't recognize that until things are in place, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in that view, as people around the regulating community is looking at this, is like, okay, we see our regulations and the implication or the impact it has on products coming to market and who is able to bring those products to market and what kind of products are brought to market. So with this new technology, let's rethink that. So is the policy we put in place going to create a more level playing field versus creating what I think are unintended consequences of what was perceived as those folks are bringing products to market. Right?
Mm-hmm. I'd like to build on this a little bit, and perhaps a little bit on what Carmen said as well, because I think the GMO debate went the way it went for a variety of reasons. It's not necessarily IP that prevented smaller players in the landscape to engage. It was also the cost associated with bringing a GMO to market. I mean, if you had to look at $150 million to bring a GMO to market, not everybody had sort of what it took to do it. The beauty of CRISPR is it is a more facile and much more affordable technology, particularly given proper regulatory structures, right? And so that's where one can start contemplating that this technology could have a completely and can have a completely different application. GMOs, because of the cost, were sort of limited to corn and soybeans, right? I mean, the really big crops. A more affordable technology can go into fruits and vegetables and trees and a variety of things. And so that's where we see also our responsibility. So we were fortunate in getting access to the technology from an IP perspective early on. And we accumulated a pretty good body of IP that I wouldn't say we can control, but to some extent we can control. And we made a decision to not control it exclusively, but actually to make it available to the entire plant agriculture field. So that's where we're engaged in trying to basically make the technology adopted across plant agriculture. And I think it's very important for the perception, and it's important for where we go from a regulatory frameworks perspective as well.
If I could build on that then, from an economic perspective, we can in fact make an argument that that putative $150 million cost that you lay out there, Matt, is not just exogenously created by the regulatory system simply doing what it needs to do in order to establish a level playing field. That instead, when one or two major players within a field take the research tool and in essence weaponize it as part of their competitive position in the market, that then generates incentives for other companies and other players to question them, to challenge them on it. And first they'll do that formally in the courts, challenging the patents. And then if that doesn't work, they'll go at it a little bit more indirectly, still formally, through the regulatory system and filing challenges there and saying, wait, we have reasons to question, or finding proxies to do so. And then if that's not working, or even in parallel with that, moving toward soft power approach to the competition and raising questions in the public's mind about the appropriateness of this technology. All is fair in love and war and in market competition, it turns out, and all of these theaters become part of the competition over the future of innovation in the field.
Thanks, Greg. And Matt, I think in your comment, you were kind of flagging in a way that intellectual property in and of itself, even if we get it right, isn't going to be sufficient for navigating these broader questions of who benefits and what the resulting public good might be. But what I want to ask as well is, before we even get to that broader landscape that will determine the outcomes, are we confident that we're getting the IP landscape right, and that the evolving models that we are seeing, including what Corteva is doing, are actually laying the groundwork for that greater access, that greater public good? And I think that's a question to anyone, really, but whether from the perspective of someone who studies IP or works in IP and what you're seeing in the field, is everything falling into place, or from those who maybe sit outside that field and are learning about it and thinking, do we have everything in order, in this house before we look at the broader community that it sits in? Reactions to that? Is the IP landscape, in shape? Are there questions that remain, or is it going to get us there?
I mean, if you, I don't want to look at the bigger picture, IP as a component. But from a regulatory perspective, we can't sit around and wait for the IP landscape to shake out before we figure out what we're going to do, because I think the market's also waiting for a signal from us, right? The investment market, just the entire landscape is looking. So we have to do, from a regulatory perspective, what we need to do. But I think, this is maybe just me being a naive person thinking about this, is that when folks think you have access, if access is granted broadly, then immediately tomorrow I'm going to have a plant. I'm going to be able to put something out. I mean, certain companies still have a competitive advantage, right? So if I'm a small company, I have 20 people working on a product. Corteva has hundreds and thousands of people working on thousands and hundreds of products. So the probability of me getting a product out before Corteva is what it is, right? So, and also for say ARS scientists that says, oh, CRISPR is awesome, I want to use it in avocados or plums. We have to figure out the fundamental science behind that. Can I even tissue culture? Can I transform these things? And those things take time to build as well. So I think, for someone to naively think that just because we have access, we're going to have all of a sudden tomorrow everything is going to be flying off the shelves, from potatoes to avocados. That's my favorite one. I think that's kind of naive to think that way. So I want to kind of temper that expectation. Right?
It's certainly,
Go ahead. Yeah, let's get Carmen in.
Well, I just wanted to follow up because I think that's a good point, and it's certainly this idea of competitive advantage has come up among some of the interviews that I've done with different stakeholders, and that's a concern. And I'm not sure that the public is necessarily going to be able to tease apart, who has IP and who controls that versus who controls certain traits. And so they're going to have a different perspective and view on it. And so I think one question that has come up among groups that I've talked to is that you might have more companies have access and develop new traits, for example, but companies with competitive advantages will, buy up that technology. And then from the public's perspective, that'll probably be, again, these big companies who are controlling certain products and traits. So I think, changing the IP landscape might not necessarily change the public perception in terms of who controls the final product and the traits. And so I think we still have to think about that. And then the other question, it's sort of a question I have for Matt and maybe others, is that, I think we have companies taking this very progressive view in terms of trying to think about providing more access to different companies, but not everyone has that view. So again, if you have some companies who do want to retain tight control over the technology, and I've heard some of that in terms of animal traits, where I think there's going to be much more controversy than in plants, then are we still going to have some of those? I don't think this is going to make the debates go away, in other words. And so...
Matt, do you want to respond? There's a lot of themes that came up there, but my original question was just, is the IP landscape, in order to be able to, or at least evolving in the right direction to get us towards some of these other goals? And also, to Carmen's, I think, question around how do you account for the fact that folks may take a different perspective on how they want to manage and allow access to their IP?
Yeah, so I think in the question there's actually a number of things, but if we take it back to the IP, we know that within the CRISPR landscape there's still a lot of uncertainty about who owns the IP, who controls the IP. We as a major corporation don't deal very well with this uncertainty, and that's why we've taken sort of the measures we've taken, which is to seek licenses, in some cases exclusively, with, from Vilnius University, from the University of California, indirectly, actually from Caribou Biosciences. And then we formed an alliance with the Broad Institute to really consolidate all that foundational IP, so that on one hand, we were mitigating our risk of engaging aggressively in sort of developing product concepts around it, but also being in a position to do what we're doing right now, which is we've basically consolidated this in a way which takes the uncertainty, the IP uncertainty, out of the equation. And we can provide access to this body of IP. So I think from an IP perspective, we've been fortunate to be able to mitigate sort of the uncertainty. The regulatory uncertainty remains, and the public acceptance uncertainty remains. Of course, it's very different for a smaller company or a bigger company to bring a product to market, but we're also operating in different markets by and large. For what Corteva is concerned, we were very much in commodity crops. We are not in avocados, for example. But there are companies, and smaller companies, who are in avocados. They're smaller markets as well. And so I think it's very much a landscape now where there are chances for a lot of protagonists.
So Matt, Greg, I want to ask you, do you agree with Matt when he said that he thought the uncertainty has been largely mitigated? And then go ahead.
I don't think it's gone away, but I would agree that it brings it down quite a lot into a manageable level, both for your own purposes as a company, but under the joint licensing framework that Corteva has set up with the Broad Institute, it does provide reasonable comfort to investors in some of these small companies. So there is an opportunity, yes, I agree, for there to be a much wider scope of innovation using these tools. I think, though, that there is a reasonable element to your question there, Julie, though, about whether the set of tools represented in the current licensing framework from Corteva and Broad Institute really are going to constitute the cutting edge of the science as things continue to move forward. I think it will be an important foundation, but what I imagine is that a lot of other seed companies and trait developers are going to need is a license under the Corteva Broad agreement, and a license from someone else for an advanced method or an additional piece of the puzzle that they will need in order to achieve their ends.
Perhaps just a couple of words about this, and we actually recognize that, and so that's where our open innovation framework comes into play, because we're not stopping at CRISPR. CRISPR is an important foundation, but transformation methods are, you can't do CRISPR if you can't transform, and Fanley sort of pointed to that. I mean, basically, we don't know today, in many plant species, we don't know how to transform them. But that's where we also decided, particularly for the smaller companies, to make available some of these tools, which we have, and which we won't exercise in those spaces. We're not going to transform avocados, right? So that's where the open innovation framework comes into play. Right.
This conversation, of course, also sits within a broader context beyond just agriculture. And so we're talking about intellectual property and concerns and challenges and opportunities in the context of CRISPR and ag. But I want to ask, what is unique to agriculture in this conversation? Whether it's the public perceptions we're encountering or the regulatory challenges or the IP challenges, what is unique, and are we learning things from other applications? Are other applications learning things from ag?
A couple of things that are unique about ag in my mind. One is the legacy of biotechnology in agriculture, the GMO controversy, that all of this is occurring against the backdrop of. I think over in the medical sciences and certainly in industrial applications of biotechnology, there's not that legacy. And so we're having to deal with that here. The other thing that in my mind is unique about agriculture is the scope of the research enterprise, the research and development enterprise for agriculture. It's international, much more so than in many other industries, including medicine. And it's, I would say, much more heavily publicly funded than R&D in other industries. Let's contrast it, say, to IT, but even in the biosciences, I think the balance is stronger in agriculture. So we have to worry more about the universities and how they are using CRISPR, and especially after they've gotten the basic and even the applied science done, but if they're ready to then try to move something into commercial agriculture through the channels that have been established to do so, that's going to occur at least as frequently in agriculture as it is in other parts of the life sciences.
Other thoughts on what's unique to ag, Carmen?
I mean, I'm not going to tie it to IP, but more broadly, I think there's some key questions that people care about in agriculture that we don't think about in terms of health, and I always think of them in relation to some of the grand challenges we talk about that we're facing today. So climate change is one of them. So when we think about climate change, we recognize that agriculture has a big role to play in affecting climate change, but also helping to mitigate the problem. So a lot of the discussions we're having around CRISPR and these novel technologies is also the role that it can play in terms of addressing some of the major environmental challenges that we face. So from climate change, but also soil erosion and drought and so forth. So major environmental questions related to agriculture, sustaining rural communities and so forth. And then how people think about food. People think about food differently than we think about other technologies. It goes in our bodies. We have religious, other normative values that we associate, that we care about in terms of what we eat and how we eat, that we don't think about in relation to other technologies.
Yeah, I have to agree with Carmen on that. I come from the biomedical field, so it was very odd to me when I moved into the ag field, the kind of native reaction people had with high technology in agriculture. And I think we always say the agriculture sector, but we have to say agriculture and the food sector, because the consumer is not reacting to agriculture, they're reacting to food, right? And it's cultural, it's value laden, it's family laden. So to talk about access and ownership around that has a very different lens than talking about phones, where we don't have a cultural connection to that. Well, maybe my children's generation will have a cultural connection to that, but we don't, right? So we're not tied to it as much as we are tied to food. So I think that just put a different lens on IP, on regulation, on just about the sense of control, personal control, as well as societal control or national control over food. I think that just adds another layer of complexity to the conversation.
So I want to talk a bit about priority setting and agenda setting, because I think some of the things you were speaking to, Carmen, are kind of capture what those who are most enthusiastic about the use of CRISPR in agriculture talk about from an aspirational perspective. Climate change, sustainability issues, food security and or food sovereignty issues, empowering the ability to have more solutions for more crops, for more people in more places. So we'll put that frame on for a minute, and let's just assume we get the IP right and the regulation right, and all of these pieces are falling into place. Where do the priorities ultimately get set? We've talked a little bit about the fact that if more people can use it, maybe there's a diffusion of the choices and priorities that are being made, but I want to go back as well to the conversations around, this tension of universities versus corporations and all these things that roll into, I think, fundamentally the question of that folks might ask of who's speaking for me or who's looking out for my interests. And, in that sense, who's controlling the trajectory of the application of these technologies towards what people might define in different ways as the public good. So it's very broad framing, but I want to talk a bit about that. Even if we had everything right, in the end, are we setting ourselves up to make sure we're making the choices that matter the most?
I would like to respond to that in saying that, well, first of all, it's quite a hypothetical. But if we did have all the intellectual property and the regulatory, the level playing field, and the democratization of innovation did kick in, then you have really the right recipe in place for the public to decide in the marketplace and to vote with the pocketbook and say, this particular innovation aligns with my family priorities and my values and my tastes and my needs for convenience, and I'm going to buy it. And I'm not going to object to it. I'm not going to pick at the retailer who offers it for sale. And we'll see demand pull for those things that really do meet societal needs. And we'll see people walk away from or ignore or not purchase the things that they don't need. And that's not a bad situation to be in, quite honestly.
So you're relying on a consumer framing, I think, if that's a fair interpretation of how you create the demand pull. I'm just going to play devil's advocate. Are folks still getting left out of that? If we think about social justice, distributive justice, is the market, is the consumer going to send the signals that are going to solve climate change, and that will enable CRISPR to help solve that? Again, aspirationally and hypothetically. Carmen or Matt, do you want to jump in?
I always think of this as it's a process, and it's always context specific and it's political. And so we have no idea how this might unfold. And so we're trying to set ourselves up to think about these questions of fairness and justice and equity and power in order to ensure that these technologies unfold in the best way possible, the fairest way possible, and so forth. But things change, and so you think about GMOs and the GMO. Think about for how long GMOs have been commercialized before the labeling debate took place. So shifts happen. And this is where I think, consumers are important, but also what sociologists think of as social movements or activist groups who are really, organizations who, organize around specific issues and seek to advocate on behalf of those issues, whether it's, water quality or food safety or whatever it might be. And so, and they shift depending on what happens. So for me, they play a really important role because they are, helping to, frame a particular problem in a way that different publics can understand it, and frame it in a way that might resonate with people's values at a particular moment. So, at one point in time, the GMO debate didn't resonate with the public, despite what activist groups said, but in framing it in other ways, it resonated. So I think that it's important to be thinking about what these different groups are saying, and not just rejecting out of hand because we might disagree with their perspective, but taking seriously some of their arguments and their perspectives and trying to engage in a serious manner with those concerns.
What I think a lot of this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for us, a large corporation as well. So we often talk within the framework of offering products to our customers, the farmers, everywhere in the world. We talk about being able to deploy the best technologies for that. We feel we can do this only if we have the appropriate social license to do it. And that's where our fields intersect, and that's where it becomes very important how consumers perceive products that are being delivered through this technology or other technologies. We're not escaping climate change, and we're not escaping, the dead zone in the Gulf and so on and so forth. And we're very aware of that, and we're having active programs to actually, be good citizens of the world in this regard. One example is a product which fixes nitrogen so that it doesn't all leach out and end up in the Gulf. That's a product that exists today, right? But as we're thinking about climate positive agriculture, and we have now an initiative that rewards farmers for practicing climate positive agriculture, we just feel like we're sort of citizens of the world as a corporation as well. And if we want that social license, we have to do what's right.
I think from a USDA perspective, it's about agriculture has a cultural cornerstone for the U.S., right? So we need to figure out, as if everything works out beautifully, is where do we put our resources and priorities? And part of that is to make sure that we're prepared, right, for invasive species, for fall armyworm, well, not in this country, for African swine, things like that are not on the consumer's mind, but has huge implications if it happens. So part of that is having the tools available for us to be prepared, right? And then also to address some of the challenges that our farmers are facing to producing a way that the consumer wants to buy, right? So there's one farmer that says pretty much that for every consumer want to eat a certain way, we will find you a U.S. farmer to produce it in the way to meet that consumers. But to do that, there are consequences and implications. And you want for that farmer to have all the tools that is available to him to meet that consumer demand. So some of that, it's so far removed for the consumer, but from a USDA kind of ag perspective, we have to take that longer view, given that we want to have agriculture as to remain a cornerstone in the U.S. culture, right? So I think that for us is the way we would plot out our strategic plan looking forward. Yeah.
Thanks. Can I just add one thing? And it's always problematic when we talk about consumers and imagine that they're homogeneous in their preferences, which they're not. And so I think one of the big challenges is always how do we respect different that consumers have these different preferences, and are we able to unfold this technology in a way that's going to respect that? And I think that's a question that we haven't really addressed. There's always there's organic, but I don't think that's adequate. And so I think that's still a question that we have to wrestle with, that there will be consumers who might wish to opt out, and do we wish to respect that or not? And I think, again, reflecting on the GMO debate, that was where some of, where companies got into a lot of trouble, because there was a sense that they were trying to hide something or they weren't being transparent, and it just created this distrust when perhaps we could have taken another route.
Thanks, Carmen. We're going to close out this conversation in just a few minutes here. We started with a kind of narrow focus, with Greg kind of giving us that groundwork on just the intellectual property dimensions of CRISPR and agriculture, but we've obviously broadened the conversation out much more into these societal considerations around control and access and what that means for where we go with the technology and what purposes that technology ultimately serves in applications in food and ag. Given that broad journey over a relatively short amount of time, I do want to pause as we wrap up here and just ask you all to reflect kind of in enlightening fashion on what the next step or the next step in a conversation on that interrelationship between intellectual property in a very narrow form and broader societal discussions on control and access really needs to focus on. Whether it's a question or even a solution, but where do we need to keep ourselves focused as we move forward? Whether it's a recap of what you already kind of said, or just a final reflection that maybe you haven't shared yet. Where does this conversation need to go in the future?
I mean, for me, I think the step is attempting to identify what are some of the potential concerns out there now, and that what we think might emerge, and how can we engage in some conversations around those. And that's not easy to do, attempting to figure that out. But I think people do, there is a lot of hype at the moment. This is this revolutionary, this amazing technology. It's going to deliver all these benefits, and we can get caught up in the hype. And again, critics say we did this with GMOs. And, maybe we need to pause a little bit and think about not everyone shares that view, and what are some concerns that people might have about, trade-offs, off-target effects and so forth, and let's engage in a conversation around that.
Okay.
I think the scientific community, the business community, and the broader public need to learn one way or another that, at least within the agricultural field, the intellectual property situation for CRISPR is neither deeply contested the way it's been portrayed in the media, largely thanks to the pooling mechanism that the joint licensing framework has put into place, but it's also not unilaterally dominated, that it is available out there, that it is in many respects a different world than the GMO world, or even the pharma or biopharma world that most consumers probably assume.
Thanks, Greg. Hanley or Matt?
Well, I think from a government perspective, as we're thinking about technology writ large in agriculture, we feel at USDA at least that we need to do a better job telling the story of agriculture. Like, how do we end up where we are? What are the mistakes that we made and how we are addressing those? What are the gains that we have done? What are the good that happened, right? So I think we haven't really done a good job telling those stories to the greater public, to the general public. And I think we need to do better in that way. And it's hard for a government because we're very good at talking at people, like projecting out, but how to have a dialogue on modern agriculture and its role in our economy, in our daily lives. I think that's really important because that set the context for a lot of this conversation. So from our perspective, it's not just having a narrow conversation, it's actually having a broader conversation and setting this in the context of modern ag writ large.
Thanks, Hanley. Matt, where does the conversation need to go?
Yeah, so I don't know, I've heard transparency, and I would say radical transparency. That's going to be very important in this debate, and there's a commitment on our side to be transparent. I also think, to some extent, to be a little simplistic, the proof's in the pudding. And really starting to see these product concepts being advanced, and particularly the ones that are not coming from the big seed corporations, but that are addressing perhaps needs and desires that the consumers may have. I think that's where I hope we'll get something concrete to talk about, right? I think that starts to make it really real. And that's what I'm looking forward to.
Great. I think my lesson and takeaway from this is it's hard to have a conversation about intellectual property in isolation. And I think that's what you're all saying too, is that it really isn't just about the patent laws or the intellectual property laws. It's about the interconnectedness of all of these different questions and concerns. So I'm sure we're leaving a lot of questions unanswered, but we'll thank you now for your comments and reflections in this session. And we look forward to the continued conversation in the future.